Hi, and welcome to episode 16 of Talking Shit About with me, Elizabeth, and Link in the background, root toot splootin'. You know, when they drag their bodies on the ground, and he just loves rolling on carpets. Anyways, we're on part 4 of our grief series, and that's going to be the last episode on grief for now. Maybe it'll come back. I would love for it to come back. But 4 months is enough, I think. These episodes come out the first Friday of each month, where I bring a guest on and we talk about something that's shitty for one reason or another, and we try to find the good in it by the end of it. If you are interested in knowing more about death and dying by people who know what they're talking about, you can check out the work by Caitlin Doty on YouTube, or if you search her name in any podcast app, you'll find her. You can listen to Ologies. Link, shut up! You can listen to Ologies with Allie Ward, and she has a couple episodes on thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. You can read the works by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a little dated, but big name in the death industry, and Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, a very useful book for me. Maybe you won't get anything out of it, but it's worth a shot. This episode with Dana was not recorded in person, although it was supposed to be, but due to my poor scheduling skills, we had to do it over Zoom. Worth noting, I didn't eat anything before the interview and recorded it at 7 o'clock at night, and I had been doing hard labor in the sun all day, so I was in really rough shape, and you can tell. Dana's great. Dana's fantastic, so listen to the interview. It's amazing, but just know that's all on Dana, and I'm really sorry about my... You'll know it. You'll know it when you hear it. I'm recording this in August, but we recorded our interview a couple months ago, maybe a month ago. Time is fake. And she came out to visit the other day, actually, and it was really good to see her in person. And I had finished editing and recording the intro for her episode before her visit, and I had this really long story that I shared, and I was feeling really emotional, and later, Link's feeling emotional too. And later, when I was listening back to it, I was like, wow, I'm a hot mess. I'm going to re-record this at some point. And then she came to visit, and we had an excellent conversation, and the story that I recorded on the intro came up organically in conversation. And so I was like, well, actually, okay, I am going to tell that story. Link, buddy, I've recorded this so many times, I'm not going to record it again. I'm sorry. Okay, this intro is starting to get really long, and now Marty's tuning on me, so I'm going to tell the story really fast, and then we'll get to the episode. So, sad story. I was driving home from a really long, rough day, and on the side of the road, up a little hill, I saw a doe, and I saw an itty-bitty fawn, which I was very excited about. I mean, I see a lot of deer. I see them every day, but it was covered in spots, and it was just so tiny, and something about tiny animals. And so I slowed down as I drove past, and I noticed they were circling something on the ground, and I looked down, and it was another fawn that I'm assuming got hit by a car. And so they were nudging it and, trying to get it to move, and it ruined my fucking day, because my brain started thinking, well, how many animals die every single second, every single day, because of us driving just for convenience sake, on an individual level. And then I was like, oh yeah, and humans. Factoring in all of that, is it worth it? Is my trip to the market to go get ice cream worth it? The risk of death, either animal or human? Marty, get off of me. This is dramatic. Okay, she's right. It's taking a long time. And I just wanted to tell you that story because, like I said, it came up organically in conversation, and it's really sad, so it's a good way to kick off this episode. So let's go ahead and talk some shit. All right.
Cool.
I am here today with writer Dana, I know she does other stuff, but that's kind of where my mind goes when I think of her. So, hello, welcome.
Thank you. Good to chat with you.
So, before we get into all the nitty gritty, I will go ahead and let you introduce yourself. What kind of makes you you, what you're interested in, just what you want people to know about you.
Cool. Yeah, well, my name's Dana. I am 22. I am currently a grocery store cashier, though I'm in the midst of wrapping up that part of my working life. And I do occasional stand-up comedy. I write a lot of short stories, and I spend a lot of time in the woods. And I guess that is about the rough of what I am.
What kind? I almost asked what kind of comedy. I don't know if that's even a question. I don't know that much about comedy. What kind of short
Um,
stories do you? Or yeah, if you have an answer.
yeah. Well, in terms of comedy, I tend to do a lot of storytelling. I often joke that I am not particularly funny, but a lot of funny things have happened to me. Um, I struggle sometimes, even though I do it pretty regularly, to consider myself like a stand-up comedian because I mostly just talk about things that have happened to me. There's very rarely like setup and punchlines. It's just sort of like here's a very absurd experience.
Mhm.
And honestly, with any kind of storytelling, like with my short stories or like I've written some longer form pieces, but it kind of ends up similarly where I'll just take a piece of my life or my experiences and usually apply. I tend to write more like kind of genre fiction, falling into like horror or fantasy, or sometimes more like modern magical realism. But I'll usually take some core experience I've had and apply a kind of a more fantastical lens to it, and then just sort of let it tell itself. And so yeah, I tend towards genre fiction and that sort of thing a lot.
What formats do you typically write in? Like, do you publish them? I know you post these beautiful Instagram posts with pictures and then just like lovely stories. What are your other formats?
So I do a lot of kind of fairly standard short stories, usually, kind of like 6 to 10,000 word little pieces. Kind of these little snippets of larger worlds and lives. I don't have anything published currently, so it does feel very silly to call myself a writer, but I'm kind of working on that in the process of that. One of the unfortunate realities of any creative industry is a lot of that is not really in my hands. All I can do is make the product.
Mhm.
But yeah, I have written a couple of novellas, and I've got one novel that I've written that it's in a rough draft stage. So there's not really anything I can quite do with it yet. But yeah, I tend towards slightly longer form pieces. But yeah, I also do like to sort of on social media or whatever, just tell these little stories from experiences I've had, just like with late night run-ins with strangers or just kind of odd moments that I found myself in.
Are you up for talking about your novel?
I would be. It's been some time since I've worked on it. It was a piece that kind of I started when I was very young. I was about 18, and I've been working on short stories more. So I haven't picked it up for a good few months, probably maybe a bit closer to a year now. But over the course of a few years, I wrote the rough draft for it, and it's kind of a medieval fantasy story about a pair of or a group of kind of political outcasts and bandits who are going through a hostile land and trying to attempt a few very simple goals, but finding that the world does not lend itself to simple goals very well. And so it's kind of, I would say, a fairly like kind of low fantasy character drama, just about a group of people trying to get by in a world that is not particularly fair or kind to them.
Do you have any particular themes that you focus on when you're writing, or does it just kind of vary story to story?
Um, I find it varies story to story, but I also find that no matter what I write, I can't escape being me. So often my stories become these very talky, philosophical sort of things. Like my one of my favorite genres of any kind of fiction is high concept genre fiction, where the high concept stuff is more background noise, and what the bulk of the actual story is just like people sitting around talking about kind of their experiences and philosophies and conclusions that they've come to through them. And so often, like my stories will have like, maybe like the occasional fight scene or like scene where there's like a big magical moment or whatever. But most of it is just sort of characters sort of talking through things together and kind of how the relationships through those moments form. I prefer to write about the quiet between storms rather than the storms, if that makes sense.
Hmm. So every interview I've had this like awkward moment where I'm like, how do I do this segue? So do you write about your dad? Because you lost your, sorry, this is so ungraceful. Are you comfortable talking
No.
about your dad?
Yeah, so I do write quite frequently about that experience. I tend to fictionalize it very heavily. What I wrote most about it, I wrote a novella after I took a road trip with his ashes. Not long after his passing, I had found a key to his old home, the one that we shared when I was growing up, and the home that no longer exists. And it felt very odd to me holding on to this key. So I decided I wanted to get rid of it in a way that would give me some catharsis and some sense of permanence. And so I put his ashes in my car and I drove to Washington, and I tossed the key into the ocean and then drove home. Over the course of about 72 hours, I covered about 1,000 miles on very little sleep. And it was a very strange experience, especially considering my only company was this box of ashes. And so when I came home, I still had, because I took quite a bit of time off of work for it, I sat down and I wrote a little novella with the rest of my time off. And it takes very directly from those experiences and from the experiences of like kind of losing him, the things that led up to that trip. But it does it through these purely fictional characters who, all of them share some piece of my history or like my relationship with my father or with loss, but who are addressing it from a very kind of fictionalized point of view, which I personally find is the easiest way to write about those kinds of things, because I find there's a kind of fundamental inability to understand other human beings that sort of comes with the human experience. So when you talk directly about the things that have affected you, a lot of that is sort of lost in translation. But when you make it so you're instead talking about the things that have happened to someone else, even if most of it is things that have also happened to you, it kind of makes it so you have to make it more understandable. Because you're not able to sort of treat as a given certain things or assume that other people's brains work the same way yours do. You kind of have to adjust and make it so that this fictional character's experiences are understandable to you, rather than just that your own experiences are understandable to you, because they always will be, but they're not always going to be understandable to other people.
Do you find the writing is like cathartic at all?
I definitely do, and I often I do find too that kind of in lending pieces of my life to characters, I then have to examine it more than I otherwise would. So if I take some flaw or some vice or some attitude from my own life and I attach it to a fictional character, I then have to sort of justify and explore that. I have to ask, why does this character do this thing? Or why do they feel this way? And often we don't think, or at least I don't really think, to ask those questions about myself and why I do these things or why I feel that way. And so by attaching it to a character and having to write that character in a cohesive way that makes sense, I am sort of forced to self-examine. Because by asking why that character has this trait of mine, I sort of have to ask why I have this trait of mine.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds, yeah, like a good way to deal with some shit. Yeah, I'm like thinking that I'm like, maybe I should try doing this. I'm just like not very creative, so that's unfortunate. But
It can be hard, yeah.
yeah. So this road trip that you took, did you find that cathartic at all? It sounds like it was just kind of an impulse thing, is that right?
It very much was. I had come to the decision a couple weeks prior to the trip itself. But yeah, it was sort of the sort of thing where I I tend to fixate on these very small, very symbolic things. A lot of my life exists in metaphor, for better or worse. And so I fixated very heavily on this key. And as soon as I found it, I felt distinctly the need to get rid of it. It sort of represented to me this kind of hope for something that couldn't be. And I felt in keeping it, I was allowing fantasies for something that was untenable or that couldn't come. And it was sort of strange actually getting there to the ocean. I hadn't been to the ocean in my adult life. I was there once when I was 7, but in my whole memory of my time with my father, I can never remember a time we saw the ocean together. I think there may have been one when I was very young, but this was the first time I could remember doing it with him. So it was sort of nice in kind of discarding the key. I was marking an ending, but in bringing him, I was also marking the beginning of a new memory shared with us, but this time with a corpse or with ashes rather than with a living man. And when I threw the key in, there was definitely a feeling of, funnily enough, I expected it to be bigger or more kind of momentous, but it was just a sort of quiet understanding. It was a kind of the perfect day for it too. It was raining extremely heavily. There were some signs warning about going on the beach, but I had driven 700 miles or so in a haze, and I was obviously not in a particularly rational state of mind, and so I wasn't going to let that stop me. And the beach was full of just these discarded bits of dead shells and things. There was a heron that had washed up that was just curled up into this little ball of rot, and standing there, it felt very kind of cinematic. And so I threw it in, and yeah, it was just this moment of, it was cathartic, but more than that, it was just quiet. It was a kind of, in that way, I think when a major realization happens, it happens in stages and then all at once. So it forced an understanding into me that I logically understood, but I don't think emotionally had really acknowledged yet. That kind of truth that that key was never going to find the door to that old house, and it was never going to unlock it, and I would never open that door and find my dad on the other side, because that house was gone, and that key was just a key to nowhere now. And so in getting rid of it, it was a kind of undeniable acknowledgement of that fact, and no longer having the room of that, at least emotional, if not logical denial. It forced me to kind of look at the way things were. And so yeah, it was a very cathartic experience, I would say.
Are you spiritual?
Uh,
Is
yes.
that a tough question?
No, I, when I was in high school, I got really into existentialism, and I still have a number of very existentialist tendencies. I'm a very, very hyper individualistic person, and most of the things I do, I feel the need to do on my own. And so I have come to appreciate God in my own way. Like I said, I guess I don't think I did much, but there's a place in the mountains that was a great comfort to me in after my dad's passing. I'd been going to it as a camping spot for a couple of years prior. It's just this little fire pit off a dirt road tucked away in the mountains near Clinton, and it was sort of the perfect place to get away for some quiet. And often I would go spend my nights out there after everything that happened with my dad. And sometimes when I was hiking along, and occasionally this still does happen, there would be these moments I'd hit a nice point of elevation and the wind would pick up, and I could hear it moving through every tree and every branch and every leaf and every stone. And it would just sound to me like the most beautiful music, like the whole mountain or even the whole world was singing. And every time I hear it, I can't help but feel, and again, maybe this is just my tendency towards symbolism and metaphor, but that song, that kind of music of all creation is God, or at least my version of God. So yes, I would describe myself as spiritual. I don't, not in, I suppose, a very traditional way, and a lot of my gods are, my views on gods are very particular. I don't think of God as like a thing with a will or a thing that thinks. I think it's more like a mirror or a shadow of creation. I do have love for God, but I don't see it or sort of the arc of the universe as being particularly kind or just. I think things just are.
Do you think that has impacted the way your grieving process has gone?
I would say it certainly has. I it is a comfort to me to think that however it happens, all things that exist play a part in this sort of song, this kind of music of God. And it gave me comfort to know, or to believe anyway. Knowing is a very strong word for spiritual matters, but at least to believe that my dad too had a part to play in that song, and that I too have a part to play in that song, and that whatever ends or whatever hurts, in the end, it is all contributed to this symphony. And so, yes, it has been a comfort to me. I don't think of God as kind or as sort of compassionate to creation, but I think of it as beautiful. And I think that to be a part of something beautiful is a reward of its own, even if that beauty is often wrapped in cruelty or difficulty.
What are some other things, whether they be like tangible, like eating a lot of ice cream, or more existential, like internal processing that have helped you through the process of grieving?
Well, I have found that just talking helps a lot. Particularly, I developed a habit, and this is it's very silly, but it was very helpful for quite a while. When sort of things got to be too much, I would often just drive off to my little spot in the mountains, and I'd spend the night alone, just watching the stars. And when I wanted to talk about things that were difficult to talk about, or that I felt might be troubling for people to hear, I would just talk to the mountain and just sort of ramble on for an hour or so, and just whatever was on my mind or whatever I was feeling, I would just sort of speak it out. And I guess in that way, it was sort of like journaling, which I also tend to do from time to time. Sometimes I find just speaking aloud is a lot more cathartic, or kind of it feels a lot more real than just writing something down. It kind of puts it into the world in this very significant way. So I find, yeah, even if it's not a person, just finding things to talk to is helpful. I mean, I've developed a habit. Occasionally, I will, I have my dad's ashes on a little spot of bookshelf by my writing desk, and occasionally I'll put a hand on it and just say, hello, or not a full conversation, but just a simple acknowledgement of it, and to still know I can speak to my dad even if he can't talk back it's very comforting. And so I think just being able to speak your experiences, even not to a person but just to anything, is it's helpful, because in saying it aloud, I think you have to examine it.
Mhm. How about things that are unhelpful or that have been challenging?
Yeah, I I have found that often what is helpful is also in its own way unhelpful. The last I reached the first anniversary of my dad's death a few weeks ago, and funnily enough, I spent it very similarly to the way I had spent the night of his death, in that I stayed up all night watching the sunrise. But as opposed to a year previous, wherein I was sitting in his hospital room and he was moving on, and he left as the sun rose. And this time I was alone wandering the city and watching the sunrise. And it was this kind of parallel that it forced me to acknowledge how much had changed in this year, and also that I had let certain things lapse. And since then, I've spent a lot less time out in the mountains, because I've come to understand that a lot of this last year has been spent nursing my wounds, which was necessary and helpful in ways, but there does come a time where you have to move on from that. And so I found I've been trying to kind of refocus on my life down here among kind of the human world and my domestic affairs, rather than spending every chance I can get running off to just be alone in the mountains and sort of be nothing. I do find that is one of the benefits of isolation or of the wilderness, is that there's no expectations that kind of come with human society or culture, in that they're up there, to me at least, there aren't words for things. Language and sort of politeness, those things don't really exist. They're just a series of objects, some of them living, some of them not. And when you are alone out there, I feel, are just another object in this world of nameless things. And so it creates a sort of escape from yourself, which is necessary, but it also can easily become a crutch. And so it's a behavior I've had to kind of learn to straddle the line on.
I have this impulse when I'm in like flight mode, or yeah, if I'm just overwhelmed, it's like, gotta get to the woods. Just get to the woods. Like,
Yeah.
there's no people there that can stress you out. So yeah, I totally feel you. But there's also, yeah, something about being in nature that is genuinely good for your mental health. Yeah, I don't know if that's a factor, but
Oh, it definitely
yeah,
is. I
it
think,
definitely is.
yeah, just reminding yourself how much larger the world is than yourself, because
Hmm.
it is easy to think of the world as nothing but human beings and their losses or your own losses, but sort of just seeing a place without human beings and coming to understand just how much more complex everything is. There is so much anxieties, at least that I wrap myself around in the day-to-day life of just being a human being and living in the human world. And then when you get a little space from it, a little perspective, a little sunshine and greenery, it all feels very small and petty and a lot easier to handle.
Hmm. You would think that feeling small and insignificant would like be bad, but sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's nice to realize that things aren't happening because God hates you, or I mean maybe he does, but God hates you, or you've stacked up a lot of bad karma for not putting your shopping cart away, so you deserve everything that's coming to you. And it can be so easy to be lost in that headspace, but just recognizing that, oh, I'm just a speck. Yeah, there's just all of this chaos. I feel like the concept of chaos is becoming really popular right now, which is good because everything's chaos.
Oh
But
yeah.
just recognizing, yeah, that you're not the center of the universe. There's just shit happening, and sometimes you're just dealt a shit hand, and then another, and then another. But that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities and good things out there. It's just that's where you're at.
Yeah. Well, I think that guilt and shame are still kind of expressions of ego in their way, and that like we want to feel like we're in control, and so by extension, we have to make sure that we have to see everything as our fault. Everything bad that happens to us has to be some karmic justice or some result of our own decisions, because if that's not true, then that's pretty scary. And so I think, yeah, often we hold on to guilt and shame to feel in control. And then when you understand that smallness, that you really are just this tiny voice in a chorus of voices, then that guilt and that shame feels a lot less powerful. And I think so too. Do the factors that cause it? I mean, I I feel much less sort of afraid of death or antagonizing towards death when I just see how much bigger the world is. That little spot in the mountains, that's going to outlive me by, well, practically forever. And so it's nice to know that I have been this small blip in this massive tapestry of history that has carved itself across the landscape. And to know that so much of what I am, the things that have made me what I am, are going to continue on beyond me. And so in that smallness, I think there is a great power.
Hmm. Fuck, that was so beautiful. Sorry,
Oh,
brain
thanks.
catching up. How do you, I guess, do you want to talk at all about your relationship with your dad? Because if I'm not mistaken, you feel like I heard you, not heard you, Jesus Christ, saw you write about him, like before his passing, like you guys were pretty close.
We had our issues, particularly in my adult life. We did not see each other as often as we ought to have, and that was just two people having busy lives. But I lived with him for a great deal of my life through most of my childhood. It was split custody. The last year of high school, I lived entirely with him, and we were very close. Particularly prior to his diagnosis, there were a lot of complications. My father was a very wonderful man, very intelligent and very loving, but who struggled a lot with vices and with bitterness and with loneliness. And sometimes it could be painful to see. And there were a lot of weaknesses in him that I found myself very bitter towards in my adult life, kind of things that I wish he had been better at or had done more with. And it is something I do look back on and sometimes feel very terribly for. the last time I saw him prior to his diagnosis, he was returning my car because I had loaned it to him for what was meant to be a very brief period, but turned into a very long period. And our interactions in that time, I was very curt and very annoyed with him. And then, a month or so later, I got the call from his ex-girlfriend that something had happened to his leg, and she wasn't entirely sure what it was, but it had, and essentially what we learned later was he had lung cancer, and it had spread throughout his body to the point where a tumor had formed on his femur and then popped and snapped the femur in half.
Mm.
And so he was life flighted out to Spokane because that is apparently a very specific specialty. In that bone or cancer on bones there's not a doctor in Montana who knows how to deal with that. And so I went up there to go see him, and as soon as we knew shit had hit the fan, I mean, any issues between us were resolved immediately, because even though as I said, there were certain issues I had with my father and certain times that things between us got complicated, but we both loved each other very deeply. Funnily enough, I have noticed one of the odd aftermaths of grief is that I hate Spokane, Washington more than any other place in the world. Uh, and I have legitimate issues with the way the city is structured, but mostly it is probably because it's the place I went to learn my father was dying. I remember on the second day going to visit him, and he was speaking with a priest because he went to Sacred Heart, which is I suppose a religious hospital. I don't know the details of how it's run, but I know there's a church there, and the priest had been sort of speaking to him about end of life things, and my father detested religion. And so when I saw him speaking with the priest, no, he was not an unspiritual man. Most of his beliefs could be ascribed to a sort of loose Buddhism. But he was not a big fan of most structured religion, Christianity in particular. And so seeing this priest left me with this distinct impression of just how real this was and how permanent and how serious. And this priest was, I feel bad for it because he was a lovely man. He was very kind, but he just looked like the kind of guy who is the dad in stock photos, like kind of early middle age, very square jaw, big smile. And he came over and shook my hand, and it was a practiced handshake, like that sort of handshake that's very firm and a very, very sure, but feels just rehearsed and kind of inauthentic. And in that moment, I think I hated that man more than I've probably ever hated anyone, for being happy, just for smiling at me in this moment that to me was so grave. But afterwards, in the month or so following the diagnosis and leading up to the death, I helped my dad with his final arrangements, with gathering his things, with discarding of any sort of embarrassing materials he wanted me to get rid of, with contacting loved ones. He hadn't spoken to his extended family for quite a long time. And so me, my brother, and our mother, his ex-wife, we all had to sort of wrangle them and get them to his hospital room to see him off, which was a little difficult. They were on the other side of the country, but we managed it. And in doing so, my father and I grew very close. I saw him as often as I could, and I found myself spending every spare moment I had thinking of what could be done for him and doing what needed to be done for him. I find in high stress situations or in times of great need, I tend to obsess with what is necessary and sort of restrict my emotions somewhat. And that is one thing I do regret slightly in that process of his dying, is that I was going a million miles an hour doing everything I felt needed to be done, but very little of that time was spent actually being emotionally present with him. But yes, we had a good relationship. It had its issues as I moved into my adult life, but especially upon his diagnosis, we became very close, and particularly in how he responded to it, in that he demonstrated a will and a pride and a dignity that I've frankly not seen in any other human being. As soon as he got the news, he said, I don't want to prolong this with treatment and have a miserable few years. If this is me done, this is me done. And he didn't pout or cry or make a scene about it. He just said, "This is it. So it's time to face it." And I have more respect for him for the way he handled that than I do for most people.
Mhm. Did you find that spending, I know you were very busy during that time, but getting those things done and stuff, was that, and getting to spend the time with him, was that helpful, do you think, for your grieving process?
It was, I think. It is a complicated thing in that those those that I think it was roughly a month and a half in between diagnosis and death. So that month or so was it created an intimacy between my father and I that we hadn't really had in quite a while. In that we both were deep within this shared experience, and that has its positives and its negatives. I came to know, I feel, and to love my father in a way more deep and more true than I think I had as a child or even as a young adult. I felt in that moment we were two adult human beings kind of confronting this thing together, and in that sort of shared struggle, there was a real kinship that I think is hard to find between people. But it did also come with its difficulties. The last night in particular was one of some trouble to me. I am very much nocturnal. I work nights. My job before it, I was a night shift janitor. And I also just enjoy being up at night. Being a country kid, I like having outdoor areas to myself. Like being outside. To me means being alone. And in the city, that's only true at like 3 in the morning. So I spend a lot of my time just wandering the city very late at night. And my brother, who I love very much, he knows this. And so in the final days, the last night in particular, I had caught a nap earlier in the day, and he called me. And he said, "Hey, me and my fiance have been driving for a very long time to get here, and we've been watching him for most of the day. And can you, since you're up so late all the time, come and watch him over the night to let us know when we need to get everybody together to see him off?" And so obviously I did, and that night I spent mostly alone with my dad, eventually watching the sun slowly rise. And at that point, he was unresponsive. His breathing was terribly shallow, and occasionally he would make this sort of choking noise, and his breathing would stop for just long enough for me to lean in and wonder if I was about to have to make that call. And then he would gasp this horrible wet gasp, and I would have to go back to waiting and watching. And that night is left me with the distinct impression that heaven and hell are for the living. I think when my dad died, he just died. But that night in that hospital room, that to me was truly hell. And I felt in a lot of ways, particularly in the aftermath, and why I think it has taken me a great deal of time to kind of return to a normal life, is that I felt in many ways I followed my father into the land of the dead. And we reached a point where he kept going and I had to turn back. And obviously, logically, I understand the answer to why that happened is he had cancer and I didn't. But there felt to me sort of a great injustice, just this profound failure and loss in that there was a point we reached where I could no longer follow him. And I didn't really understand exactly what that pain was until that anniversary came. And I spent the night similarly up all night, slowly watching the sunrise, but this time alone. Because I noticed distinctly how much less lonely I was on this anniversary. Because I think there is not a lot more lonely than watching someone go somewhere you can't follow. And so that was a difficulty to me. And that kinship and that shared struggle, it brought us closer, but it also made that loss, I think, all the more painful. He had a good death. When it came time, I made the call, and my brother and his fiance and our uncles and my mom and her husband and his ex-girlfriend, they all made it there in time. And as he went, the sun had risen. It was a beautiful sunny summer night or summer morning, and the birds were singing outside. And then he went, and we all were there with him as he did. And so it was a good death, and I got him there, and I am glad and honestly proud to have been able to do that for him. But that night was, yes, if I am speaking frankly, probably the worst night of my life. Um,
Yeah.
um, but yes, I think it does help in a lot of ways to have seen him in those moments, not I suppose the last couple days, but when he knew it was coming, demonstrating this just sort of profound pride and dignity. And I have found since the anniversary, kind of trying to readjust myself and move on from this sort of state of healing and in many ways of hiding. And something that I thought that struck me, that I have found has kind of guided me through this beginning stage of the next period of my life, is that I want to live with the kind of pride my father died with. And so, in that way, he has left me with a great strength, or at least a great aspiration, to follow in those footsteps.
Mhm. With that in mind, how do you feel now compared to when you first found out about the diagnosis?
Calmer, I think. Um, in the time of the diagnosis, I was very much in a flurry. It was a period of great confusion, and it was not made easier by a number of factors. I remember just getting so angry. On the second day, I he was in Sacred Heart. We were expecting some test results that we knew it was very, very bad, but this would essentially tell us whether it was terminal, or if it was terminal, just how bad it was. And so I went and got a nurse once I came to see him, to tell me about these test results. And this nurse walks in, and it is his first day on my dad's case. So he has no prior knowledge of what has happened. So he pulls up a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet, and just starts reading off like Latin words and numbers to me. And I sort of cut him off at a certain point, and I'm like, hey, man, I don't know what any of those things mean. That is your job. I need you to tell me like the translation of this.
Yeah.
And he sort of just stroked his chin, and with this painful nonchalance just goes, well, if it's in his blood, it's probably stage 3 or 4. And
Uh,
just to have someone sort of treat what to me was probably the most important thing in the world as this kind of casual little maybe this, maybe that sort of sentiment. There is one thing I found that has alleviated itself quite a bit, is that grief lends itself to a very intense kind of bitterness. When he was dying and in the aftermath of his dying, I found myself just getting angry at the sun for rising and the world for turning and life for moving on. It felt in a lot of ways like I was being left behind with the dead. And I've been able to move on from that and mature from that sentiment. I would like to think entirely, but I suppose nothing is healed from entirely. But I have let go of a lot of that bitterness and come to accept that there is beauty in the ever turning of the world. It's sort of, as I said before, with that kind of being small comes with a lot of peace and knowing that you're a part of something much larger. Knowing that the world still turns and the sun still rises, even as such large parts of my life live and die, gives me some sense of peace to know that the world will go on. Even if everyone I love dies and I die, the world will keep turning, and something out there will still exist, and somewhere out there there will still be beauty.
what advice would you give to yourself at that point when you first found out about the diagnosis? If you could go back in time, grab yourself by the shoulders and be like, "Hey, I need to tell you this. this will hopefully be helpful, what would it be?
Well, in honesty, there is one thing that has taken me some time to move on from as a source of some regret. In that my father and I did not have a very physical relationship. I have a very particular relationship with touch. I'm not a very physically affectionate person, and he is rather similar. We did not hug often. Occasionally we would. It wasn't. It was by no means a cold relationship, but we just were not very physical with each other. And I caught myself during the times of the diagnosis so caught up in listening to him as he talked about what he needed done, in helping with the final arrangements, in getting the things he needed to his hospital room so he could decorate his deathbed. I never made the time. As I said, I struggled to sort of be emotionally present for him in that time rather than just to sort of be this pragmatic force doing what needs to be done. And to speak honestly, I did not hold him in those in that month he was dying. I don't think of those things when things are serious. I don't really think about those small touches of human comfort. I think of hard, factual, simple things to be done. I tend to get very utilitarian. And it is a pretty large regret of mine that I didn't hold him until he was already dead. And holding his hand, there is a profound stillness to a corpse. It is more still than an inanimate object. It's disorienting, honestly, a little terrifying. Just that intense lack of movement. It felt like touching a mannequin. And so if I were to give myself advice, I would say that in the end, no matter how much you do that needs to be done, you can't save someone who's dying. You can just be there with them and hold them as they go.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That was sort of my wrap-up question. But I wanted to invite you if there's anything else you wanted to touch on, or if there were any stories that have come to mind,
Hmm.
you're welcome to share.
Well, I think we've hit all the bases. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I've covered kind of I suppose the rough of all that happened, kind of my experience with it. Yeah, I have or had in my life previous experiences with death. But yes, I think that that month and a half and the year that followed with my dad, that was the first time I think I truly came to intimately know death. And in a sense, I suppose I am grateful for it in that it is never a bad thing to know the ways of the world, and knowledge is never a bad thing. And death is, for better or worse, very much inevitable. And there are going to be people in your life you lose, sometimes very painfully, sometimes very helplessly. But to know that and to carry that knowledge and to know how those things work, and just even if it doesn't necessarily give you any power to change them, just to know them, I think is important. And so I suppose, in a way, though frankly I would give up a bit of knowledge if it meant having my dad back. I am grateful that I was able to come to know and to learn about death in such an intimate way, and that it allows me, I think, to have a better understanding of it. When I speak to people who are struggling with their own grief, I work at a grocery store that is a lot of regulars, and many of them have gotten maybe a little too comfortable telling me about the worries of their lives. And sometimes, I'll have to talk someone through a loss or a medical episode. And now I feel much more equipped to do that. And so I think I am at least glad that I have been given that much, in that I am able to provide comfort to people in a way and within an experience that previously I would not have been able to.
Cool. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, well, thank you for talking. This was very nice, and
Yeah.
it's very good to hear from you.
That's a wrap for this month's episode of Talking Shit About. Thank you, Dana, Amanda, Bree, and Ferd for being a part of this series, and thank you, listeners, for listening. If you haven't gotten a chance, please give the show a rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I will see you again next month. Stay safe, healthy, and happy.